Welcome back to the Guns and Mental Health podcast, sponsored by Walk the Talk America. I am Jake Wiskershin. I'm joined by Michael Sodini. Hello, Mike.
Hello. It's good to see you. And on Saturday morning, this is a first, Gianni, Dr. Pirelli. It's the first time that we're coming out on a Saturday for somebody.
Oh, wow. Thank you. I appreciate that.
And that voice you hear that's not me or Mike is Dr. Gianni Pirelli, all the way from New Jersey, where it's almost lunchtime, but we just woke up here in Nevada. Introduce yourself to us, sir.
Hey, everybody. I'm Gianni Pirelli, a psychologist out of New Jersey, and I kind of practice in the New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania area, do a lot of trainings and publishing on guns and mental health, and happy to be here with this really groundbreaking podcast and mission that's near and dear to my heart over the last decade, essentially. So I'm very happy to be here, guys. Thank you.
You are kind of our muse, as I wrote in the email asking you to come on, because without your book, which I will hold up for the people watching on YouTube, The Behavioral Science of Firearms, which came out, 2018, 2017, 2018?
19 technically, I think.
It's we wouldn't be where we are, and it's essentially a 600 and some page one of the most comprehensive literature reviews I've ever read, and it basically gives it gives a lot of direction, but one serious direction that created one of the I guess the most popular things that we do at WTTA is you exhort clinicians to get competent in the culture of what firearms is and what they do and who owns them and how and why and all that stuff. And it is a suicide interventionist pitch. So we'll get into all that for sure. I want to hear a little bit, I think, about why you got into this. And I do want to call attention to the fact that this is the first time since the John Petrolini podcast that three handsome Italians have been on the same screen together. So.
And two of them from New Jersey.
That's right.
That's funny.
That's funny. Let's dip into that well.
So yeah, well, thank you for that. So, essentially, and again, you can see this at the preface of that book, which incidentally was supposed to be half of that size. So just goes to show you this is kind of the arena that never ends, as you know. Once you kind of start tapping into the where they call it wormhole or what have you, it just keeps going. And as I actually wrote in that book, I think one of the saddest parts was twice I had to update this was the largest mass shooting in U.S. history and so forth, active shooter. So that's the type of thing it is. And as I said in the book, it's a timely area, and for better or worse, it's a timely area. And so as legitimately, it was supposed to be about half that size. But again, you just keep going, right? You open one door and then three more things need to be addressed and so forth. And so it's kind of like fixing up your house or something. You deal with this room and then all of a sudden there's three more things, you have to do, and it's kind of what I've found in this area. And I have a good perspective on that, actually, because I have published before in areas like competency to stand trial and other hard-hitting forensic areas, but they're very slow moving. You can really get into those areas and leave them where they are, and you can almost revisit it 2 years later and there's no difference. In this area, as you well know, it's just constantly moving, because it's hitting so many spheres, politically and socially, and of course in the training arena as we're dealing with. And so in terms of how I got involved as a licensed psychologist, as a forensic evaluator out of New Jersey, as I said, I basically I got one or two calls, very early on in my practice, and I never heard of it before. And I was someone who went to a top forensic school. I went to John Jay. I was actually in their first incoming class of their PhD program. Now, I guess it's 17 years later or whatever it's been. So it's been a while, but I was actually in that first class. And so we had tons of forensic people, and we were hitting all the subjects that I thought, on predators and you name it, insanity, competency, every angle of forensic I thought. And then I get a call like this. You can imagine I was so surprised. I said, well, I don't even know what this is. What does it mean? Like I need a gun eval, in New Jersey in particular, I'm sure we'll talk about, people get flagged for very benign things, extremely benign things. And so I did what I thought I was supposed to do, which is I consulted the literature, but that didn't lead me very far because, particularly at that point, everyone's talking about gun violence, quote unquote, but nobody was really speaking of, here's how you do a gun eval for the average person who maybe was never violent or whatever the case may be. And so that didn't lead me far. And then I went kind of back to old supervisors and teachers and professors and what have you. And that fell on its face as well because nobody knew really what I was talking about or what to do. So, this is kind of what I've made a bit of a career of in terms of my publishing and my practice and so forth, is really getting into areas that nobody has really touched upon. And you actually see that with some of my other publications. And if you were to look at, for example, like third party presence in the context of a forensic eval, what are the effects of that? Or using internet, social media data in your forensic evals, or vicarious trauma type of thing. I like to get into areas that people are not really talking about and get the conversation moving. So that this became that. And I had no idea it was going to come to this. A lot of people, they go in and say, this is what I want to be. And, if you asked me 10 years ago what my life was going to look like, I'd say I'd be a professor, perhaps, and maybe do a couple forensic cases, or I'd work at a state hospital and maybe do a couple forensic cases on the side. I had no idea I'd be in full-time private practice, group practice, talking about guns and books and all this. I had no idea, but I guess for me as an adult, what I learned to do is go with the organic growth, not force certain things and try to go where things, may lead you. And I allowed myself to do that, frankly, so it's really more of a credit. And if you see in the book, I believe I really, at least in the first book, the ethics book, I don't going to really get to, but I really thank the clients and the examinees and the patients and so forth, because it's really that it's them. They thank me when they call. Oh, thank you so much for doing these evals. I said, no, it's really you. It's the need, and it's the people who really need them. So it's really because of them that, especially out of New Jersey, that this need is there, and I just kind of went with the need, really. And it's been an interesting ride, and it continues to be. So again, I just really want to also thank you guys, because I could yell into the wind for as long as I want to. I've been doing it in other areas, frankly. I would be really disingenuous if I sat here and said, everything I do kind of takes off. No, 95% of stuff I've read, I've written, people have not read. I'm sure, it hasn't really taken that interest. So this happened to be an area that I guess resonated and had a bigger need. Yeah.
Uh, I want to highlight a couple things before I see Mike wanting to jump in, but I want to slow it down a little bit because our listening audience is pretty diverse and varied, and you covered some things, or at least brushed up against a couple things that I think we need to break down. The first one that hit my ears is that, and this is just personal to me, you allowed yourself to let natural order unfold, and you didn't like force your own desires. I think that's really key to a lot of people finding peace in their lives. First of all, if you just kind of like say yes to the things that make sense and like let go of your own ego attachments to like what you think is best, you're going to find life going a lot easier. But that point aside, I heard in there, I think, and this will lead to the second point. There's some unintended consequences of legislation, and I had a pretty negative experience recently. I've worked with our legislature for a number of years on a whole bunch of things, chiefly rewriting a lot of laws in my own profession. But recently, I went in with this very well articulate. I thought it was well articulated. I bounced off a few people; they said the same thing. Opposition to a proposed mandatory continuing ed credit requirement. It's going to go into statute, and I got in there and I was allowed 2 minutes, and I went in and I timed myself, and it was about 8 or 9 minutes worth of testimony in this thing that I'd written, and I heard 20 to 25 minutes of prop up for this proposed legislation, and I was like, I have the same level of pushback with the same level of research and evaluation, but I wasn't allowed to share it. And so it was like, come hell or high water, that piece of legislation was going to go through. And I don't like that, particularly in a pandemic where testimony is limited. But this is my point, is that we're going to end up with some unintended consequences out of this legislation. And I'm purposely being vague because I don't want to throw anybody under the bus. But But with red flag laws, that's a really well-intended piece of legislation by people who just didn't bother to do any research, and then likely suppressed opposition in the hearings and the work groups. Because now what we're finding is, as you said, there's some really benign reasons that people get flagged, and I think that's problematic. So when we craft this policy, we have to consider all sides. We have to be very deliberate about it. And no matter what the apparent urgency may be, we have to slow down and make sure that we've considered all potential outcomes so that we don't end up un, unfortunately restricting people's rights or opening the door to grifters to come through and sell their wares or what have you, which leads then to my other I guess point that I heard, which is that people in the community reach out to a psychologist, right? And they say, I need an evaluation. And they're like, well, first question, you're like, what are we evaluating?
Right.
And in this particular case, you didn't even know. You had to go find this stuff out on your own. So I think I want to spend just a little bit of time educating the audience because I deal with this all the time, at least in my realm, where people are like, I need my kid to get an evaluation, right? Whether it's for disability or
Sure.
intellectual delay or what have you. And now we've got this legal evaluation for, competency or whatever. So can you talk a little bit about what types of evaluations that psychologists do and how that differs from talk therapy and all that stuff? I'd
Sure.
appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you. So, in terms of, well, so you really have clinical assessments and neuropsychological assessments and so forth that a lot of psychologists have certainly engage in, which are usually primarily for treatment purposes and making diagnoses and so forth. As a forensic evaluator, basically you can get into criminal, civil, or what I would say are administrative types of evals. And so criminal evals could be competency to stand trial, insanity, violence risk assessments, and so forth if they're trying to plea bargain or for sentencing. Civil evaluations or personal injury, someone gets into a car accident, they start developing depression, anxiety, PTSD, whatever it may be, and then you might testify in that case. Or that could also happen in employment harassment, discrimination. Of course, a lot of people are probably familiar, unfortunately, with custody, child custody evals, and those types of things, workers' compensation. A lot of that falls in the civil arena. Then you have this kind of, quasi forensic area, which is kind of administrative, and a lot of times that could be fitness for duty. You've probably heard with officers. It also could happen with teachers or really any job, frankly. Where someone is raising concerns, mental health concerns, and then they need essentially a clearance, as they call it, quote unquote, to return. Same thing for schools. Kids pose a certain risk, violence risk, sexual risk, suicide risk, whatever they need. Again, kind of some sort of evaluation to return. And firearms in some jurisdictions like mine sometimes are more administrative and sometimes they're purely legal, which I'm sure we'll get into. But in other words, if a new applicant in New Jersey, for instance, is flagged, and the report is intended for the screening police department, that you're still really in that administrative realm. It's not a legal case per se. The second they get denied, now you're at the prosecutors, the county level with the prosecutor and the Superior Court judge. Now it's more of a legal, matter. And so you have these kind of different areas. So to your point, and when people call, and this happens all the time, and it frankly happens with attorneys who say, oh, I've been practicing for 20 years. This is what I need. And I'll say, well, that's, you're trying to clarify the referral question and say, well, that's not exactly how I interpret it. And, it gets a little tricky sometimes as to what people need. And sometimes it's because of the referral source, or I should say the agency needing it or the person needing it is not clear. I can't tell you how many times, I mean, it's multiple times per day that we get calls saying, I just need the police department said, I need a letter for
Yeah.
my guns. I need a letter. I need a letter. And I say, well, that sounds very simple. That sounds really simple. You just need a letter. And I tell them, well, the Second Amendment's only 26 words long. So, that's even shorter than a letter. I'm like, what does a letter mean? You only need an ID to fly a plane. What goes into it? So that's really tricky. And we can talk about that as well, especially from, frankly, a business standpoint, where they've been told they just need a letter, like a checkbox. And now I'm going to tell them how involved this is going to be and how much it's going to cost and everything. And people get really thrown off. So we deal with that all the time, where the referral question is unclear. But yes, as a psychologist, you can theoretically offer evaluation services in different areas. Some are more purely clinical, and some start to get into that, again, quasi forensic area where, you know, it can really lead easily into a legal matter, and some are obviously purely legal on their face. But as what I would say to everybody, regardless, even people who think they're not forensic, is think about it. What I always tell people is anything could turn into a legal matter in 1 minute. In 1 minute,
Mhm.
you know, and so, you know, one of my earlier, I still talk about it, but of course the guns has consumed a lot of time. But we really used to spend a lot of time addressing standards of practice, forensic versus therapeutic roles, and so forth. And what would happen is I would do these trainings, and only forensic people would show up. And I was like, but it's really actually more for the non-forensic people. But people didn't understand that really, and I think maybe still don't understand that a lot. They think, oh, anything they time they hear forensic, I don't want anything I don't want anything to do with that. I have no interest in that, so I'm not going to pay attention. I'm like, no, you need to know. You actually need to know more than the forensic people as to when you're getting into that
Right.
realm, because you may not want to be forensic, quote unquote. But guess what? 50% of people get divorced. A lot of people get into car accidents. And if you start to go down the list of how people can easily and always become legally involved, you know, they get hurt at work, you know, all those areas I just spoke about in terms of people say, there's a very, very, very good chance that your clients are going to be legally involved at some level. And so when it comes to writing a letter for a gun, and I'm sure we'll talk about this as well, mental health and medical professionals quickly oftentimes just say, no, I won't touch that with a 10-foot pole. But then they'll quickly write a letter for disability or
Or
some other legally relevant area,
emotional support
and
animals.
they get into deep water at that point. Because if you look at, just saying anecdotally, we're doing an actual empirical study on it right now, but anecdotally, I've looked at New Jersey's complaints against professional psychologists, and you have a fair amount of people writing those quote unquote letters and so forth in custody matters and what have you. So it's really the non-forensic people oftentimes who are going to inadvertently maybe just dip into that area. And so your point is extremely well taken, where we have to be like crystal clear as to what our role is and our scope is. And sometimes it's not simple, because you could, this is a very important point, frankly, which is people think they identify a certain way. Oh, I'm forensic, I'm not forensic. No, you're not what you say you are what you do. So you could be practicing clinical psychology in the morning and forensic psychology in the afternoon.
Right.
And you can't play ignorance to that. You can't say, oh, well, I'm not a forensic person. No. If you've engaged in that work, you are now is incumbent upon you to address those standards and everything else, right? So
Yeah, and if there's any clinicians listening to this, we have it spelled out in our ethics, and I've studied to enough degree to know that across the four major professions of, you know, drug and alcohol, professional counseling, marriage and family therapist, social work, and it's pretty much the same for psychologists too. If if you are treating someone, you can't evaluate them forensically, and if you're evaluating someone forensically, you can't treat, and that's uniform, and it's really important to know. I'm so glad you pointed that out, because I'm always hammering on this in supervision, and we host a lot of interns and students here at my agency, and they're like, you know, can I write this letter for this person? I was like, you can write what you've done, you do not prognosticate
right.
ever. And
Yes.
we've gotten in some hot water, or flirted with hot water a couple times with things like car accidents and, you know, civil litigation. It's like, you know, so and so's PTSD was caused by, I was like, you got to be careful with that. You don't know that
Right,
it's
right.
caused by what they said it was caused by. So I really appreciate you saying that.
And if I may, one quick statement here in this handbook that we're writing, and again, I'm sure we'll talk about that as well. I call it the therefore problem. The therefore problem. You're fine until you hit therefore, and then you have to stop. Right. So you could say Miss Jones was involved in boom, boom, boom. She's experienced boom, 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 blah, blah, blah. The second you get to that therefore, right, transition, you better stop if you're not in that role. You
Yep.
know, so I kind of call it the therefore problem, you know, and it gives people, I think, kind of uh, a mnemonic, if you will, or something to kind of just remember that. Say, okay, yes, exactly what you said. I can explain things where I'm going to get into a problem is when I link it, and when I try to link it, therefore, to a legal, issue and so forth. And people think, with forensic work, oh, it's just clinical work applied to the law. No, it's not. It's obviously its own specialty onto itself, and there's a million different implications. But once again, the pressure is out there. In fact, in our practice, which is heavily forensic, we engage in certain like care management organizations and so forth locally for young kids in need, but they're really treatment evals and they're clinical, pure clinical. But again, that youth sometimes is also legally involved. And so then you get public defenders calling, sometimes the judge, and then we have to push back. And they're like, but wait, you're a forensic practice. I'm like, yes, but this evaluation was not that. And so it is difficult, but you really have to, roll in scope. That's what I always say, is just stick to that, roll in scope in any given case, and just hang on to that, because again, the pressure can be real, and attorneys and so forth. I think it's throughout the country, but especially the state I'm in, New Jersey. I think we have 100,000 registered attorneys in a state, this big, highly densely populated. So.
Yeah, there's a lot I want to ask about that, but I don't want to bore everybody who's listening, and I don't want to be super selfish. Mike, I know has a bunch he wants to ask.
Yeah, one thing I want to point out why your book really spoke to me is when I first started Walk Talk America, I had to go and try to find. I was a little naive. I thought, hey, the firearms industry can come up with some money and fill in some of the gaps that all of the mental health side are saying, like, hey, we've lost all this funding, and therefore we can't fix things or make an attempt at it. And that sounded good to me. Right. But then I quickly found out that, there wasn't a whole lot out there. And from what I could see from some of the organizations, they kind of took an anti-gun stance. I needed to find somebody that, even if they didn't like firearms, they stayed completely neutral. And I had read some other publications and stuff like that. And it was the same old thing. Rob Pincus actually said, hey, look, you got to check this thing out. So I immediately ordered it. I get it. It's like I said, holy crap, my Arizona State brain is not going to be able to process all this information. But what I loved about it was, I feel like we're very similar. Obviously, we're from Jersey. We're super handsome.
Right.
Yes, exactly. No, but what I loved about it is, right from the jump, you come out and you start talking, and I totally relate to it, because I'm like, I didn't know anything about fire. Believe it or not, I didn't know anything about firearms when I got into the business. It was always my family's business. I know I've said this before, nepotism was great for me, but I wasn't a gun person. Like, I just didn't go to ranges. I didn't have a lot of experience with it. And you flat out go into this. And I love the intro, because right out of the chute, you're just like, hey, I kept an open mind, but I didn't really have, I didn't know what I was getting into. And then it kind of turned into this. So I think people need to understand, especially the listeners, that this is a huge influence on Walk the Talk America, even though we were already set up and running. But this book is so amazing, and people need to get it. I think it'll give hope to some of the people in the firearms community too, that not everybody on the so-called other side is going to be biased and can go into this and look. And there's so many different things in here. I guess my question is, as you're going, tell me how, like, how you changed with firearms. Like, I know how it happened for me, right? I started to realize things, and I'm like, this isn't as bad as what everybody's saying. What was that jump like for you, to where you went from, say, like, gun neutral?
Sure. Well, again, so as you said, from New Jersey, it might be 11% now, but it's around 10% gun ownership, right? So from the door, we have almost no gun ownership. We have, I think, the second lowest carry in the country, next to, I think, Hawaii, right? So you don't see guns in New Jersey growing up, especially at the time we grew up. Now, of course, back then it was a little different. You used the play guns and so forth, which you can't really do much anymore. But that was as close as we got to guns. Maybe once or twice, a cousin who was in law enforcement may have somehow brought you to a range or something, and that was like a once in a lifetime, like, wow, interesting thing. Now, I don't want to misrepresent. New Jersey definitely has certainly its fair share of people who have had a wealth of experience with guns. And of course, there are rural areas of New Jersey and hunting. And, so New Jersey is kind of a microcosm of the US in a way. It's a really interesting kind of state in a way. You can almost split it in half. It's kind of fascinating, as you know. But so I really didn't have that exposure, though. I didn't have really family with law enforcement. There was no hunters or anything. I mean, I was really in the heart of North Jersey suburb. 95% of the town I grew up in was Italian. It was an enclave at that time. You didn't hear about guns other than you were watching mom movies or something, and glorifying those people probably at that time when you're young, and Goodfellas and all this stuff. So you didn't really know about guns in any real way. And so for me, I go through my whole training. I never thought about guns at all. And I go through my training and I get trained in the forensic arena, and I finish my doctorate. And even after that, no issue. I come out, I start my practice. I had zero thought or interest or anything about guns. And then a guy calls me and basically says, I need a gun eval. And I was like, I don't know what that is. What does that even mean? And I started looking at the literature, and everyone was kind of just talking about violence as they describe it. And I have an issue with that term, but we can talk about that. But all that stuff in terms of gun deaths and what have you. And of course, I was familiar with the violence risk measures and so forth, but this was not a person who ever engaged in violence. So I couldn't even, if I did a traditional risk assessment on this guy, it would have been 3 minutes long. There would have been nothing to talk about, because he didn't fit into any of that. The literature didn't apply. So then again, I call kind of professors and previous supervisors I had, and they had no idea really what I was talking about or what this was. And that really gave me, well, initially I didn't really jump on it. Initially I was like, well, it's probably just an obscure thing. And I think I actually wound up doing the eval, but I did it kind of as a traditional risk assessment, and it was a psych eval, and it was probably fine, in all things being equal at that time. But then again, I got like another call. And then it's one of these things where, you see it once and you're like, oh, that's weird. You see it twice, you see it twice, you start to say, wait a minute, maybe something more is happening here. And as I talk about a little bit in the preface of that book, I said, all right, well, I'm not finding it in the literature. I'm not finding it from prior supervisors. I got to go to the heart of this thing. I got to go in there, So I went to the local gun range. And I talk about it kind of in a humorous way, although it's true. I went on a date with my now wife, and as I say in there, she shot better than me, which I understand is normal for females. Oftentimes to shoot better than males, particularly newcomers. I guess that's what I've been told. But anyway, and I met with, as I put in the book, Anthony Calandro is the local gun range here, gun for hire and so forth. And I was really shocked, honestly, because I didn't know really what to expect, but I didn't expect that. I mean, his range was like immaculate, and it was almost like, I don't know, I almost felt like it was like it was a nice place, but it was so weird, like to walk into that, I guess whatever preconceptions I had. So then it just stuck in my head. And then a few days later, I called and I said, "Can we talk?" And he was great about that. And I started asking him, like, is this more common than I think? Because I'm getting some of these calls. And then it just started evolving, pretty quickly. And it's one of these things where, once again, you think, what's the word? I think the term's called pluralistic ignorance or something. I know it's a fancy term, but like, in other words, you sit in a class and no one raises their hands, but everyone has the same question, that kind of thing that we've all experienced, or, even with a talk, anyone have any questions, and everyone's looking, and then one person or two people raise their hand and everyone starts raising their hands. It's kind of like that, and to the point now where we get gun calls, gun evals multiple times a day, many times a day. It's just been a little bit like wildfire. And I don't think it's a new problem. I mean, we've definitely had an increase in applications and all that. That's for sure. But I think it's more of they didn't know where to go. And in New Jersey in particular, we can talk about this, but the onus is on the applicant fully, and it costs money, like a lot of things in the legal realm and whatever. So that was kind of the way I got into it. And it really just started growing more and more. And then, if I may, I'll say another thing about it, which is when I really started getting into the literature, and there were some people who started publishing in a similar way, the missing piece, and I don't mean disrespect to them because they've done great work. A lot of these folks, I won't name them. They don't practice though, and and that's fine. I mean, not everyone necessarily can do everything, but I am in full-time practice and evaluation. And so a lot of the information in the literature I found was just really not helpful at the ground level. And so we're writing this handbook now that's going to help medical and mental health professionals in a more action oriented way than that book was. But that book, just to say, I think I said to you, it was supposed to be half as long as it wound up being. But truly, the mission of that book was that it could be on anyone's shelf. And I think we probably all experience a similar frustration as we're kind of talking about is I saw these like two sides, so to speak, and it didn't kind of make sense to me. It makes sense to me because you understand people tend to gravitate one way or another, but it didn't make sense to me why the information wasn't being shared, you know. And I understand politics and this and that, but I just that really bothered me. And so when I put the gun proposal together with the publisher, which is Oxford, um, they were kind of confused in a way. They were like, well, so is this going to be like, you know, have some sort of position statement? And I'm like, no, no, it's not that. And I think Jake, as you point out, it's, you know, essentially like an extensive kind of literature review with, if you look at the last chapter, I then go into the main findings and then suggestions for practice, policy, and research, and what have you, in each one of them. So I think there's a roadmap there that we really tried to put. But the rest of the book is really, this is supposed to just be a compendium on anyone's shelf. Literally, that was the mission. I don't care if you're in the most anti-gun group or the most pro-gun or anything in between, it can go on your shelf. And that was the mission. That's what I always tried to stick to. And that's kind of how it all came to be. And if I could say just one more thing or a couple more things, if you don't mind, just based on what you were saying, Mike, you know, you mentioned, I think you mentioned early on about funding. And this is probably an unpopular statement, you know, to make because I came out of strong academic settings and I have a lot of colleagues in her academia and so forth and grants and all this type of stuff. But that narrative of there's no funding to properly do the research, I've really fought back against that completely because I'm evidence of it. Frankly, from the day I got my PhD till now, I've gotten $0 in funding. I got funding before that as a student with some grants and things like that you get as a student, you know, travel grants and this and that. I've gotten zero funding in the last 11 years or so since I graduated my doctorate, $0. All the books you're seeing, the trainings, the 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 articles that I've published, anything you see, zero funding, $0. I write before work, I write after work, I write when I can write, and it's all organic in that way. So some research does require funding. I appreciate that, and yes, it's, you know, it's understandable. But a lot of research in this area does not, because a lot of what people are doing is taking kind of two databases that already exist and just kind of correlating them and what have you, publicly available databases. And so a lot of the research doesn't really require funding other than to say that you're paying people to do it, you know. Um, so that's a side note. And the neutral groups point that you make up, I've run into that as well, where when you say, you know, you see a lot of for and against type of groups, but then you see those kind of mental health groups, those professional groups, a lot of times are very quiet. I've had that. If you look on my website, there's been a number of interviews I've done and locally in New Jersey, I should say, and you'll see that the state organizations, they don't say a word. They're so neutral and so diplomatic, which I think is a problem because I'm going to them and I'm saying, wait a minute, why are you doing this? You don't need to do this. The American Psychiatric Association has come out with research documents saying that this law where you're calling police, for example, you know, on your own clients and so forth, you know, just to see if they have guns and, you know, these types of things. They're saying don't do this. It's not a leap to say, okay, we agree with the American Psychiatric Association or whatever, but they don't want to ruffle feathers, you know, politically. A lot of these groups, and that's why, honestly, I try to stay as completely independent as possible. Initially, not getting funding, for example, was like annoying because I was so used to it as a student, and I was like, oh, I think I should be getting funding or something. And then it clicked for me. I'm like, no, like wow, I could be fully independent. It's no offense to anyone who gets funding. I don't mean to take that route, but I'm just speaking for myself. It's become very liberating for me because I don't have to answer to anyone. I could do, in my mind, I feel like I could do pure, scientific research and make statements. You'll see on my Facebook page, I come pretty hard at people, professionally, in my state, the governor and so forth. And it's not a personal thing. It's just I can do that because I don't have a boss or somebody or a funding source to check with, and so anyway. So
Yeah, that's great. One of the chapters in the book I really loved, and there was a connection that you made, and it blew me away. And I want you to talk about this from the media and a gorilla in Cincinnati that everybody knows. I thought that was,
oh my God, yeah.
I thought it was amazing. If you can kind of talk about that for the listeners, that'd be great.
Yeah. My recollection of that was I was speaking about the attention, the media attention paid to, was it that boy, I guess, who fell into the gorilla pit, right? Versus, you'll have to kind of maybe refresh my memory, but I don't know if I was comparing it to like
Chicago.
deaths in Chicago or something, shooting deaths. And I hate to rag out Chicago. I'm not big on like the low hanging fruit type of thing. I kind of try to be more creative and thoughtful than that. But it's so obvious, sadly, when you look at certain cities, pervasive shootings and what have you. I mean, it's just so unbelievable. And I think the example I gave was the I don't know how many times, was it 60 times more or something, media attention that gorilla story had gotten, that boy, which is in kind of a crazy story, but the point is it's so sensational. And what I talk about in the book and some of my writings is this concept that I didn't create this concept, but it's certainly one that has resonated with me as a writer and as a thinker and as a doctor in this area. The worthy victim. And it's really bothered me. It's really bothered me. And with all due respect to even the presidents and former presidents and President Obama and so forth, you see the emotionality is different, when you're talking about certain gun deaths, and I guess it's human nature. So it's kind of hard to criticize people, but the same token, it's so obvious. I look here in New Jersey, for example, again, I was really critical of, with some of the stuff, and I have been, that's coming out of Rutgers, our state university, which is I think, second only state-funded gun violence research center or whatever, which I have other issues with. But the point is, the primary focus is on suicide, and it's almost been like the sole focus. If you read a lot of stuff that's coming out of there in terms of the headlines, now we know that is the majority, so I'm happy to actually see that attention, but it depends how you're giving that attention. It speaks to the example we were just saying. For example, if you look in New Jersey, and I published this recently or posted this recently on Facebook, you can check it out. Now, by the way, I don't make this stuff up. I go to the state data. It's not like, mysterious. I just go and pull the state data because I start seeing all these headlines. People who bought guns during the pandemic are more likely to be suicidal. Handgun ownership is associated with firearms.
Hold that
What's
up.
that?
So we know you're not fabricating.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I don't lie.
People who bought guns during pandemic more likely to be suicidal. I don't even know how you find that out.
And it says unsafe firearm storage increases the risk of suicide in houses with a firearm, Rutgers study says. And then here's another one. Handgun ownership associated with firearm suicide. Now, these are wow, these are really sensational headlines. People who bought guns during the pandemic more likely to be suicidal. The only thing is, it's not true. If you actually look at the study, okay, what you would find is nobody's reporting that. In other words, 0%. I put this, if you look at my post, when they actually asked the people, why are you buying guns? 0 said, I'm buying them because I want to hurt myself.
Right.
In other words, the majority say for safety, for leisure, whatever, recreation, whatever it is. So where are they coming up with that? If the people are not reporting it, see, because we're not mind readers, right? People always say when I get cross-examined in court, the other attorney always says, but you got that from the person's self-report, right? So that's so basically the only way you get in mental health. I'm not a mind reader. I can't take their blood. At least we're not at that point, whatever. So yes, it's always going to be self-reported at some level, a thought process. We use the word thought process. That just means speech, how we got it from their speech. So we're not mind readers. So how could you know that people who bought guns during the pandemic are more likely to be suicidal unless they told you that or expressed that in some way? So this study didn't touch upon that. 0 of the people said they wanted to hurt themselves and that's why they got the gun. So where are you getting this information from? Oh, one of the questions, speaks of at some point in the past, did you have a fleeting thought of, hurting yourself or something? And then that turns into a front page headline, whatever, or handgun owners with firearm suicide. Again, Rutgers study, so they're propping these headlines up with the backing of a major university. But when you look at it, you say, this is a national survey of 81 people who lost loved ones. No disrespect to them. I'm really sorry about what they've been through, but that leads to these type of headlines. And so to go back to the gorilla example, that's the biggest issue we have in a way. Remember, we're trying to educate politicians. We're trying to educate the community. We have to start with our own people, our own doctors, our own medical and mental health professional colleagues, because God, I was part of the New Jersey State Psychological Association for 13 years, I think. We couldn't get an op-ed. We could not get an op-ed. We couldn't, and it was like pure informational throughout the state. The New Jersey State Psych Association, couldn't get one. They're getting headlines every other day out of this new research center. So it starts to get like really concerning when we talk about sensational headlines and what have you. And, it's people oftentimes, they not necessarily even going to go to the study that's being cited. And even if they can, they maybe can't discern it. They're not necessarily trained in research methods and what have you. And so it's a big issue. But then when you go to the groups, as you were saying, Mike, they stay neutral because they don't want to ruffle feathers. And to me, it's like, feeding the crocodile. It's really feeding the crocodile when you talk about before, Jake, I think you were talking about unintended consequences and so forth. Because when you start feeding into headlines and legislation and you're silent on it, especially as a professional group, well, then first of all, you can't go and complain and say, geez, we don't have credibility. People aren't coming to us, for our right. Well, you're not saying anything. If the only time you're going to talk is when it's Mental Health Awareness Month and, kind of market it in that way. But when the issues get difficult and you step down and stand down, you don't stand up. So that's an issue that I've been dealing with here. And I'm sure a lot of people are dealing with throughout the country.
Yeah, I had an interesting, I would say, conversation with someone the other day, and they made a statement about how many people have been saved from a red flag law or how many tragedies were stopped. And they had a number. And I asked the person, how do you know that? Did they tell you what they were going to do? And this person danced like Diddy around that question. And I thought in my head, see, this is the problem. I will accept that person told me I was going to go out and do a mass shooting. Thank God the red flag law happened, right? And it stopped me. But I just don't see people saying that, or doing that. It's a tough one.
We put a chapter out. I think it just came out a few months ago, and we're talking about gun policy and so forth. Which, that's another problem. As a side note, we're not trained. We're trained to write scientifically, a lot of us, but then we're not trained to write in policy terms and in that type of language, and so it gets really tricky and that's why you see a lot of people. The research doesn't translate. I mean, first of all, you have the political barriers and everything we just talked about, but then you also have the language is not properly written in a way that is, really conducive to that type of thinking. But we did this policy chapter, and at first the editors pushed back. They're great editors, But at first, I guess they were kind of thrown off, but then I pushed back again, and they said, no, this is fine, because you're supposed to push the limits a little bit in terms of our thinking. And what I compared a lot the red flag concerns with was the see something, say something policies,
Yeah.
right? Because I see it in that way. I see it in that way. And what I always say about, like, that's a big thing over here, especially in New York. You know, before pre-COVID, you're going to New York a lot, you know, when you're from New Jersey, as you know, and it's everywhere. If you see something, say something, and what have you. And what I always would say is, do people are like, well, what am I looking at and who do I tell? You know, type of thing. And the best that I could come up with, because again, there's really no research on this stuff. Remember, and this is something I talk about a little bit as well. You have like DARE, remember, drug abuse resistance education. You have these DARE programs. That was found to be ineffective. Now, in its initial form. Now, I don't have a problem that things are ineffective. The problem is it took 26 years for them to say that. Scared Straight was running for almost 40 years. Not only did they say it was ineffective, they started threatening states who used it. Remember all the Scared Straight? They would send the kids to the prisons. Yeah. They said, if you use it, you could lose your federal funding because it could actually hurt people. And we started actually seeing research come out in other contexts of like these PHTs, they call them potentially harmful treatments. Because the problem is with mental health, and in particular, a lot of times people don't think of side effects. As you said, unintended consequences before is a good term. Another term is like side effects, and it could actually have a adverse effect and what have you. But anyway, so going back to the policy, see something, say something, I started saying, well, what is this comparable to? And then I really started thinking of child protective services, you know, where people are making calls. I was trying to think of what parallel is there for people to make calls on neighbors, you know, or people they know with any regularity. So I really started thinking, okay, child protective services, right? You see like ex-spouses and this one and that one calling. And I really started looking at some of those numbers, and there's a lot of concerns, obviously, because when you look at red flag laws, and they do have a good intention, I think, you know, at least at some level, right? You have one major problem. Well, you have a lot of problems, but you have one major problem. They're predicated largely on the fact, a false assumption, I would say, that people have mental health literacy, and they do not have mental health literacy. In fact, if you look at health literacy, like physical health, it's really bad, right? You wonder why you go to your medical doctor's office and there's like there's posters up over like basic stuff, like, you know, I don't know, a vaccine, or maybe that's a sensitive subject these days, but you know, it could be anything. Like, here's your ankle, you know, here's your, you know, if you think about what you look at, you know, when you're waiting for the doctor for a half hour in your little robe, freezing, and you kind of look around before cell phones even, and you're trying to like figure out what I should read. Think about what you saw in front of you. And if you actually look at the literature on health literacy, it's terrible, right? And we kind of know that. Mental health literacy is even worse, right? So this is what you guys are obviously doing. You're trying to educate people in terms of mental health, but it's really bad. So it's so bad that we have Mental Health Awareness Month, right? It's so bad that we need to dedicate a month to try to educate people. And we have all kinds of policies and, of course, and programs to try to educate people about mental health. Yet, these policies assume that people can detect it in others, a concern, and then report them. What they're not accounting for, and you see this again, if you take a look at the see something, say something stuff, they only talk about how many calls there were. In other words, they'll be very proud of that, and they'll say, we had 4,000, I'm making it up, you know, let's just say Manhattan. We had 4,000 calls where people saw something and they said something. And what I said is, that might be awful. In other words, they're equating that with high numbers as a good thing. That might mean you're falsely flagging tons of people. Higher numbers could actually be very, very bad, right? We know we can get into a whole discussion about, like, you know, false allegations. Obviously, again, if you think of child protective services, or, you know, false arrests, and, you know, that leads into a whole different,
or just straight up
area.
Racial bias, right?
Yeah, but obviously,
Oh, he looked
sure, stop and
weird.
different things. Yeah, so that's kind of what you're dealing with, and incidentally, it is related to obviously stuff that's near and dear to us, which is And if you look at that article that we wrote on the Lake Wobegon one, right, with the cultural competence article that we came out with a couple of years ago, that's another set of faulty assumptions that a lot of our laws and policies are based on. The assumption that medical and mental health professionals are either inherently equipped to handle the gun stuff, or uh, or that they're trained properly to do it. And that's 0 for 2, actually. That's not true in either area. We have now well over a decade and a half of literature, empirical research showing us that the numbers are awful, even for medical and mental health professionals. Think about it. We've went to school forever, went to school 100 years. Every day in school, Jake, correct me, every day in school, you're either talking about HIPAA or suicide.
Yeah.
So you're walking around worried if people are going to kill themselves, and you're trying to shred every paper that anyone touched. Like, and I'm being kind of funny. I know these are very serious things, but I mean, it is ingrained in your head that you got to worry about confidentiality and suicide. Even after all that, we're still not equipped, but yet my neighbor's equipped to assess it, watching me take out the garbage,
Yeah, in Nevada, because we just adopted an ERPO law at the beginning of 2020, as well as a background check, expanded background check law to close the loophole or whatever that may be. It's a transfer law. At the same time, right, January of 2020, they both went into effect. And the presumption is that we have a clinical pool to address those issues, and we don't. We're leading the nation in provider shortage. Like, we got patients coming out our ears. We can't keep up. And yet somehow we're apparently going to be shoulder tapped to do these like gun evals if and when somebody gets red flagged. Fortunately or unfortunately, I guess, like, law enforcement and the community, intervention people all kind of know. And so like, we're searching for different options besides red flagging people. Cause I've had enough conversations now with police and some other practitioners where they're like, we can't be red flagging people because it'll create this long series of this ripple effect throughout the person's life, first of all, but also secondly, the clinical community. We got nowhere to turn because nobody's. What are we going to do with the property that got seized, the gun, right? Where does that get stored? The police aren't going to take it. Who's going to be the clinician who steps in here? We don't have a bunch of psychologists. We're dead last, and we're not dead last by like a small margin. So yeah, it's a problem, and it was just poorly thought through by the legislature when they thought this. And I want to kind of turn into a different topic here, where we break down. Because the listening audience needs to know this. We teach this for a living now through our courses and whatnot. But red flag laws are more or less carbon copies of one another from one state to the next. There's little details like some states you have to be a family member or law enforcement to submit the petition to the court. Some states like your own, it could be quote unquote any person, right? And that sounds very threatening. But the bottom line is, across all of them that I've seen, the path to rights restriction is very, very easy. The evidentiary bar, the burden of proof is very, very low. It's reasonable suspicion for the random community person. For law enforcement, it's probable cause. But to get your rights back, the rights restoration, the bar in our state is clear and convincing evidence, which is above and beyond reasonable doubt. We're all familiar with that, right? Beyond a shadow of a doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt. Well, clear and convincing evidence is a step above that. So the path to rights restriction is very low. The path to rights restoration is the bar is very high. And along the way, we're supposed to be like in this community full of clinicians who just sit around with nothing better to do than to be shoulder tapped by the judge to come in and do an evaluation. That's a problem. We need to figure out a solution. Obviously, education training would be a part of that. But something else that popped into my head too is that these clinicians who would ostensibly be doing the evaluation, I want to ask you this, because in my community, we can't find anybody to do a forensic eval. Provider shortage aside, nobody wants to do it because there's this person. Maybe this is unique to Northern Nevada and the way we were trained at the local brick and mortar institutions, but we've got a head full of liability fears. And it's like, I can't touch any evaluation of any kind whatsoever because I could get sued if something bad happens 5 minutes after I utter the, issue the eval. And my pushback on that has always been, well, you put at present time, right? Or at this juncture, because I don't have a crystal ball. I'm wondering how you deal with that, firstly, and if that is a thing where you are, or if it's just unique to our region where people just like boo, hiss, put the cross up. I don't want to touch it with anybody's 10-foot pole because I might
Yeah.
get sued. Um,
Yeah.
or if it's not a thing and you navigate that. But then the second thing I want to know is how do we train people up to do these evals, or how do we rewrite the ERPO laws so that burden of proof is much lower to get your rights back?
Yeah. So no, it's a major problem in New Jersey. In fact, it's not even it's such a big problem that we have difficulty even getting collateral interviews and information from
Mm,
the sources. So in other words, a client has asked their doctor, "Can you write this?" They say, "No, I don't touch that." Fine, I'm willing to with it, pay Pirelli, whatever he's got to do, yada yada. You just got to talk to him or just get him a treatment summary or something like that. That's like pulling teeth, So forget about writing the letter directly. A lot of time, someone calls me and they say they're in treatment or something. I'm like, start now. I'm like, oh, I could see you, let's say 4 weeks from now. Start now trying to get those records together because that could delay you significantly if that person is not cooperative. Now, usually we've been able to get there and get that information, but I've had a couple of people for sure where the providers just even refuse, and that's a whole other ethical issue on their end. But it's a really big issue. Look, in New Jersey, I think the way they got around it, unfortunately, I was a big critic of this, but unfortunately, is they just removed the need for mental health, any type of eval. So initially, when New Jersey came out with their red flag law, um, they had the initial kind of draft and so forth. It wasn't passed, but the initial kind of drafts and what have you was you were going to have to get an evaluation. There would have to be an evaluation, and it was a 1 year kind of renewal in terms of the petition and what have you, even if it was finalized. And they got rid of both. They said there's no need. The judge doesn't even need to
right.
consider mental health eval, and it's the rights restriction is in perpetuity, although you could apply in the future to get them back. So they took, in other words, they just took the onus off themselves as the state. They
That's
said,
how
all
it
right,
reads.
we're
That's
not going to,
exactly how
yeah,
ours reads. Yeah, there's no
yeah, that's all they did.
it's
Yeah,
presumed
they
that
said you don't need it now.
sorry, we're talking over Zoom.
No, no, it's fine.
I was just saying
That's
it,
what they did. That's what they did. Yeah.
the presumption is that the judge will interpret what clear and convincing evidence is, and that clear and convincing evidence would be something like an evaluation. But there's no evaluation language in our law. It's just show me your clear and convincing evidence that you're no longer unsafe. It's like, well, what does that look like? And what judge is ever going to rule just from his or her own bench, be like, yeah, you look good today. You're clear eyed. Like, so where's the expert who's going to determine that? I guess is the question.
It's a major issue. What I would say a few things. What I often tell medical and mental health professionals, and of course goes back to our initial discussion of role and scope. I understand that people shouldn't do, and of course I advise people not to do forensic evals and what have you. But here's the issue they run into. They can run into for sure as these things start to pick up. Is you're going to have people coming to you and say, "Well, you were good enough to get them taken away. How are you not good enough to get them back to me?" Right? And so you were able to write that fancy report or letter or note or phone call to say I should have these or I should go to the hospital and therefore not have these rare, but you can't write anything to say that I'm appropriate to have them back.
Mm.
And so that's number one. We haven't quite seen that and come out yet, but I suspect that it will come out. And so when I kind of teach our colleagues, I always remind them of the bi-directional issue of risk management, right? And not being too strict in terms of their threshold on the front end, and it goes back to what we were saying before about educating people and being really careful about who they're kind of flagging in the first place and the things they're writing and the things they're saying. So that we're a ways away from that. And look, the red flag law here is still new. Essentially, we're still seeing it play out, so it's hard to kind of see. But we've had forfeitures, obviously just the same in the past. And so, what I can say with more confidence, what I've seen a lot of over the years, I'll get a call from, a lot of times it's a woman. It's just anecdotally, this is what I've experienced. Say, I'm looking, my husband needs a gun eval. And that's always like a confusing call, because I'm like, why are you calling, right? And she's like, well, a year ago, 2 years ago, whatever, I called the police. We were having an argument. I called the police, blah, blah, blah. And so I can't tell you how many evals we've had to do where it's a temporary restraining order. It goes to what your point is. So easy to take the guns out, because at least here in New Jersey, the second the police are called, that's the first question. Are there guns in the house? Boom, guns are taken. And for safekeeping, quote unquote safekeeping. And a lot of times it's the spouse is removed, right? They'll say, hey buddy, come on, let's come with us, let's go talk. And then they go to the other spouse and say, hey, where are the guns? Can we just take them for safety? So they get somebody, they get the low hanging fruit again. So it's kind of whoever can agree, let me take the guns, safekeeping. And then it takes years, as you're saying, and thousands of dollars to try to get those rights back. That happens, a fair amount. And so it's kind of a different discussion in terms of pushing back on law enforcement and the courts and so forth. But I would say is, the age old discussion of, is guns kill people, people kill people, whatever. Obviously, we're not going to entertain that, but let's get into the more nuanced question. What I said in those cases is, well, why do you go for the guns first? Like, even if the guns were on your list, right? They should be probably last if you were going with the science, right? So if you look at New Jersey, obviously I don't know every state's numbers, but if you look at New Jersey's domestic violence numbers and the calls and so forth, we have about 60,000 domestic violence calls a year. Only about 100 involve a gun at any level. And less than half of those involve a fatality with any gun. Now, that's still a lot of people. Obviously, we don't want anyone to die. But my point is, think about what I said about the list, the procedural list from the cops. You're going for the guns first. Well, what about the cell phone, the car keys, right? I mean, I'm not going to get into the whole like steak knife thing, but stuff. But if you really look at the domestic violence situations, they essentially involve everything else but the guns. So here's the other part to that. Not only do you go for the guns first, but the guns first and only. In other words, got the guns, here, you want to fill up the streamer, and I leave.
Problem solved.
It's like, well, what about providing them with something to help the situation? Or, as I said, I mean, the other things that could be a problem. And so that's where you have the conceptual problem. And, I hate to kind of, take on law enforcement, because sometimes people feel like, oh, I'm kind of attacking them. It's not that. It's just the other problem you see is when these legislators pass laws, they constantly immunize law enforcement, and that's the highest. Law enforcement and corrections is going to be your highest risk group. Military, law enforcement, corrections. In terms of firearm involved, suicides, as we know, and other problems. In domestic situations, what have you. So I just try to fight for consistency. Honestly, I'm kind of always saying this. I don't really care how you want to run your society. I mean, I do care, but when I speak professionally, I say I don't care, because who cares what I think? In terms of my personal opinions. I mean, we could talk about that on a Friday night if we're just talking, as friends or something, or acquaintances. But I'm not going to come out here and give my personal views. That has no relevance. No one cares about that. All I say professionally is, however you want to run your society or your state or your region or your department or whatever, run it, but be consistent. Be consistent and be in line. But this is what goes back when we talk about passing laws and unintended consequences. God, I remember when they passed the one law in New Jersey where they, are kind of duty to warn and protect law. They attached, in addition to doing all these things, if you think someone's an imminent risk, some others, you have to also contact the residential police department to see if they're a gun owner.
Wow.
Right? They just attached it to our law, which, as I said before, is against the American Psychiatric Association recommendations, et cetera, et cetera. When that happened, I did an interview. It's on the website. I did an interview at New Jersey TV, which is part of PBS, and they had the bill sponsors on there. And I wasn't on directly with them, but I did my interview and I was saying, their intention is to stop mass shootings or whatever it was. They kind of say these catch-all type of flashy things. And literally, I couldn't believe my ears. But again, maybe I'm naive. I couldn't believe my ears. Literally, the law just passed, and they said, "Well, we could look into changing it." So that's the problem, right? So that's what I'm learning about politics. It's get it in, get it down, get it there, and then we could deal with it later. Again, we saw it with Dare. Get it in, build careers off of it. All due respect to everyone out there. Run it for a quarter of a century, and then we'll worry. Oh, sorry, it didn't work. Or again, you see this in other areas of legislation. So that's what I really worry about with our legislation and policies and so forth. Is it's kind of like no pun intended, I guess, but shoot first, ask questions later type of
Yeah.
legislation, and it's like I thought I mean, again, this is pie in the sky, I guess, but I thought legislation is supposed to be based on science, not the other way around. When I was with the New Jersey Psych Association, I used to get calls a couple times from the association. Hey, can you talk to this politician or that politician? Oh, are they creating a law? No, they've created one that's about to pass, and they want to see if your science fits into it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, yikes! This is what we're dealing with,
Yeah, it's really unfortunate, and that was basically what I alluded to in the beginning about how frustrating it was to not have anybody at the table to push back on any of this stuff when it was going into place. A few years ago, we'll go back to a CE requirement.
Right.
State legislature requires mandatory suicide prevention training for all behavioral health professionals and medical professionals, and they started with us. I think because they knew that we would go, okay. Um,
Right.
but we're the last ones to need that. I mean, it's like requiring that Emeril Lagasse remember how to butter toast every year. Like we're literally the people who do this for a
Right.
living. Why are you
Yeah. Yeah.
forcing this upon us?
Sounds good.
Oh, by the way, eroding the other things that we could be learning about. Um, and so when these pieces of legislation, these policies get pushed through right away without any um, real critical analysis or review or pushback, we end up, I think, not only don't they work, it's really clear that these hastily conceived policy pieces usually don't work because they are hastily conceived. They end up creating problems where there weren't any before. Now, here's
Yeah.
the flip side of that coin. You and I should be celebrating because it
Yeah.
generates business for us.
Business.
Um,
Yeah.
but I don't want that kind of business. I already told you I have patients coming out my ears. Like I don't need any more business. What I want is a healthy, happy community. And I don't think we get a healthy, happy community by encouraging grift, which is exactly what's happening. Because now I'm seeing people come to licensing boards and the legislature saying, "Hey, I have this training that I offer. Wouldn't your citizens really, really benefit from it if they were required to take it?" And it's like, no, no, they won't.
Right.
Like, let's invite them in to take it. So what do? Well, we got to educate, and that's a public relations campaign at this point, which is podcasts and stuff like that. Say, hey, get really good at understanding the things that matter most to you, so that you're not just hastily picking up the phone and when you see something, say something. Well, what are you seeing, and what are you saying about the thing that you're seeing? Is it just reflex out of your own bias? Is it a blind spot that has you scared? The big mean guns must go away, even though statistically there's no justification for doing so. It's got me worried, but at least I'm encouraged by the work that you're doing and some others are doing to say, all right, let's push back with a little bit of reason and not be so emotionally reflexive about it. The invitation now has to be to clinicians for sure, and firearms owners also, to steep themselves in knowledge and not also be emotionally reflexive to the flashy headlines, right?
Yeah. So, it's funny when you talk about the business side, it's really tricky. And it's funny because I always am really careful what I say um, out loud, including on posts, say, social media and different things, because on the one hand, I obviously want to encourage people to go for help and all that stuff, obviously, when they need it. And that's critically important. But you got to remember, again, in certain states like mine, we're saying, but not people get flagged for benign things. In New Jersey, if you go to any therapy, couples counseling, individual outpatient, anything, just weekly therapy, you will get flagged in New Jersey and your application. That doesn't mean you'll be denied, but you'll be flagged, and it causes all kinds of problems. I have people calling me with the most benign things you could ever imagine. So I'll spare the kind of war stories. But it goes to what you were saying before, when I think of the business side but it also speaks to how we came into it. So we came into it because there was a need, right? So it's not like we invented something and now we have to find people to buy it.
Right.
We saw, wait a minute, there's this huge gap we're trying to fill, right? Not we came in and everything's okay, and now we're creating a gap that we're going to fill, which is kind of what a lot of people are trying to capitalize on with these big headlines and stuff like that. It's outrageous, and when you look at policies, one of the things that always sticks out to me is like, if you look at the imagery, I should say, the optics, I guess, is the fancy buzzword in recent years. Look at the optics of when a law is passed. And this is, I don't care what side someone's on or whatever. There's a lot of high fives and celebration. And it's always kind of peculiar to me because I'm like, how do you know it's going to work?
Doesn't
Like,
matter,
it
the
may
kid's
not,
helping.
it's like literally like, I don't know, I'm not necessarily the biggest sports person, but I have played sports. And I think of it's like, imagine you called a play in the huddle and you start high-fiving and celebrating at the time you called the play. No, like, aren't you supposed to wait to see the outcome of that? But it speaks to the issue of they don't do policy analysis. So the joke's on us as a society, because when they don't do policy analysis, or they do it 26 years later like Dare, everyone forgot about it. We're all wearing our old beat up Dare shirts, to the parties and stuff. We forgot about who cared if it worked or it didn't work or whatever. And so look, society at some level, our society at some level has created demand for us at this point, and that's good, and we're filling that, I believe, at some level. The next demand that I really hope that people start pushing for is policy analysis. You have to. It's nice to demand. Here's what happens from my humble, bird's eye view, if I may. We kind of fight for what we believe in, whether we do it quietly or more vocally in public or whatever. But then once it's passed, right? Once the ink is signed, so to speak, or on the paper, then a lot of people kind of just like walk away or whatever. No, that's when it starts. All you have to do, honestly, I don't care if you completely disagree it was passed. Try to, instead, put the energy towards, fighting it so much. Maybe use like an Aikido kind of mentality. Say, fine, you want this? Just all we need is the policy analysis. If you require legislators to do policy analysis, it will help a lot, because you will find that they're not going to be able to do it a lot of times, or it's going to be problematic. Quick example. I was fighting with a certain state agency over these certain types of evals that they were doing, and they kept putting that they were doing pilot studies, and they were kind of just getting away with the language. So I let them kind of keep saying that, but eventually I said, where are the results of the pilot studies? Where are the results of the pilot studies? Guess what happened? They stopped using that term. They stopped saying that because it goes down to accountability. It goes down to accountability, I guess, is the word. And so for me, what I would humbly suggest to people is, it's fine if you want to fight kind of the opposing view, but sometimes you don't need to do that. All you need to do is say, fine, you win. Show me now.
Well, I think it comes down
And
to
you're gonna
ego, right?
watch.
Yeah, I think it comes down to
You know
ego.
what?
You don't want to be wrong. People don't want to
People
be wrong.
don't. People, yeah, it's well, and just to speak to that quick point about, you said the number of people. No, we have nowhere near the amount of people who could do the evaluations that would be needed in the proper way that they're needed. And so that's another thing I was saying before about kind of accountability is, well, if you say to, the state, let's say in question, that, who's like, oh, people are getting flagged and all this type of stuff, and, everybody should get mental health evals. That's a popular idea that comes up for legislation over here sometimes. Okay, well, again, who's going to do them, as you said? And it'll be obvious that it's not possible unless they want 10-minute evals, which they've done with like parole and stuff. And again, people just take that for granted. If you think of like parole evals, they do these evals like 10-minute interviews half the time, to decide who's released or whatever. If that's what you want for guns, then that's what you're going to get, is you're going to get 10-minute evals and a conveyor belt, 100 people just running through these things, but you're defeating the purpose, obviously.
Unless that's the point, I mean, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I could reasonably see, because I've heard people make the argument. They know that there's a provider shortage. They know these won't be
Yeah.
done. It's purposely to restrict gun access. It's like, maybe it is. Maybe there's something more nefarious. But I also lack the evidence for that. So if I'm going to demand evidence for things, I'm going to demand it for people who speculate nefarious behavior as well.
Sure.
Like, well, show me where this is. Where have you seen this in print? Did you catch some email from some legislator?
Right.
Because
Right.
absent that, it's just some dude's idea, and I'm not interested in entertaining that. So until that point, I'm going to presume everybody's got best intentions, and there's not something sinister behind the scenes. But to that point, though, it's like, how could you? This is obvious. Like, the same people who are clamoring for more access to care are the same people who are, like, just ignoring that there's not enough bodies to do the work. I don't really understand it.
So if I were to so I agree with you, and just like a slight devil's advocate position, which again doesn't take into account the forensic versus therapeutic role issue, which people don't understand, even in our own field, nevertheless, community. Uh, Here's the thing, which is a point I've made, and I don't know how people answer it. Forget about if you want to do a forensic eval or not. Let's just put that to the side. What people choose to do in their day, obviously, is their choice. But here's my issue. And I've said this to colleagues that I know well, I'm thinking of a psychiatrist, for example, I've worked with in the past. How can you say that you can't? Now, whether you won't is a different thing. But how can you say that you can't assess someone suitability for firearm ownership and what have you, or whatever the question might be around related to firearms, and then in the same breath say that a suicide risk assessment in a purely clinical context, one of the primary factors you need to assess is the presence of a gun and how that factors into their risk? How is that possible? If the gun issue is such a personally biasing issue that you have to recuse yourself, as you were saying before, it's, kind of 10-foot pole thing. Fine, that's actually an ethical tenet, right? If you're going to be personally biased, but then shouldn't you essentially have to recuse yourself from all kind of suicide and violence risk assessment in crisis situations? Because you could be sitting there as the ER doctor or the clinic or wherever you're working, even in your own practice, and what happens if a gun issue arises? Now, that's kind of shameless plug here, I guess, but I didn't mean to. But the handbook we're writing is for this reason: it's basically, this is our model, KAD: know, ask, do. What to know, ask, and do when gun issues arise in clinical practice. We're trying to help, again, get people to jump on that, and be able to know those things. But this idea of I don't want to know about it, if you're going to say that, then humbly, you have to really, basically, how could you practice, because you don't know which client is going to come in with that issue? So what are you going to do on Tuesday afternoon at 3:30 when this gun owner that you didn't even know was a gun owner or whatever, or they have gun access or whatever the question is, they start presenting with these issues? What are you going to do? You're gonna just walk out, run away? There's nothing you can do. They're not asking you. Yeah, I understand it's easy and identifiable. If someone calls you and says, "Hey, I need a gun eval for the police," yeah, that's easy to say. I'm not doing that. What are you going to do in vivo when you're in the ER? You fill in the blank, whatever setting you're in, and this comes up. This gun-related risk question comes up. And this is obviously what you guys are doing, is trying to educate how to ask the questions and this and that. But I'm trying to push this envelope to say, look, you got to make a choice. You can't have it both ways. I'm not saying you should go out there and do forensic gun evals. I get that, and that's something else. We've developed as well. We've developed a framework for how to do firearm specific gun evals. We call it the PF10, Pirelli Firearm 10. There's domains, this and that. That's kind of a separate issue. I'm talking about in a clinical context, gun-related issues come up. What are you going to do?
Well, we've got precedent for that from it was the University of Michigan, or somewhere up in Michigan. There was a gal who was in a clinical counseling program, didn't want to treat a gay couple. So I'm butchering the thing. It was from, I don't know, 15 years ago, and she got
Yeah.
slapped for it. They removed her from the program. She sued. Court sided with the program, saying you don't get to discriminate based on personal preference, and that is literally exactly what you're describing right now. So these equal
Right.
opportunity, diversity, equity, inclusion trainings that we're dealing with now, um, the more protections that are extended for more people, the more incumbent it is upon us as clinicians to be even more non-judgmental and more educated. And when you start denying gun evals based on your own proclivities, you might land yourself in a civil rights lawsuit because you discriminated inappropriately based on personal preference. And that's a big problem. We all need to be very, very aware of and very, very careful when starting to draw these lines. I need to take that course, by the way, because I need to. Nobody's doing it, and it's going to become a bigger problem. We need more bodies, so I probably should link up with you and take that course at some point and learn how to do evals properly. Hey, by the way, I wanted to ask this because we try to address this as often as we can on this cast. Is the economic disadvantage to these laws, right? Um, Mike's favorite anecdote is, if I'm single mother in Compton, working two jobs and I just want to defend myself, I'm not going to have the resources to go pay for a mental health eval or a psych eval or a gun safety eval or risk it, whatever it is, let alone the application fee to purchase the gun that's probably too far across town anyway because of, various restrictions. Give the audience an idea of what a generic evaluation for safety or risk might cost, you or anybody
Right.
else. And
Yeah. Bad. You don't want to know. It's in let's put the slight caveat that I'm in the heart of the tri-state area and so forth out here by Manhattan. So I know colleagues in different states, have wildly different prices because of the, where they're at. But I could speak to, again, North New Jersey numbers. If you go for if you're a new applicant or a return applicant, that's a whole nother conversation because we get the weirdest situations where people are already gun owners and they get flagged, and that's a whole nother probably day. But a general kind of applicant who needs a full gun eval and report, you're looking at like 2,500 and dollars, of course, and it could on a forfeiture, red flag. You start getting into some of that heavier stuff, and depending on the records, you could be in the 3,500 range for the eval and report, and then testimony. That doesn't even include testimony. It could double. So people will call me, and I'll tell them, look, you have to understand something. I know they're asking you for a letter, but you're on the verge of being a prohibited person, or you've already been denied and you're a prohibited person in this state at this point. And so now this is not just about a letter. This is it's like asking someone for a letter to engage in freedom of speech or something. You know, I'm like, you need a full eval and report and so forth. And we have to go through everything. I don't know you from the next person. It's going to be an 8-10 page report, whatever. The whole thing, records, interview testing, collateral interviews, the whole thing. That's what's going to cost. So really in New Jersey, I could speak to, if somebody gets denied and they have to go from start to finish, it could easily be at $10,000 between me and an attorney. I mean, it's just, but but there's not much we can do about that, right? Because in order for me to do the evaluation properly, I have to block off, X amount of hours and do whatever I have to do. Okay. And it's really directly within the price range, at least around here. Looking at your general risk assessment, psych evals, anywhere between $2,000 and $4,000. If we're going to be typical, depending on what you need. If you think about it, I mean, these are 10-hour evals, whatever, with the report and so forth. So just do the math, 10 times whatever hourly that someone will make. So it's very easy to get to those numbers. And so the best thing I can say is it really comes down then to the department flagging people unnecessarily. And what I've always said is, especially the police department. So in New Jersey, there are 565 municipalities, even for such a small state. So people tend to think, oh, state by state gun laws. I say, forget about that. When people call me, I say, forget about that. I said, it's like getting pulled over for a speeding ticket. You have to think of it more in that way in terms of the discretion and variability. It's town to town, or even within the same town, you could be dealing with whoever's looking at it. And what I always push back at the police, I can't say it directly to them, I don't have that forum anyway, but what I've said at certain times is, how is it possible, with all due respect to law enforcement, and I have a lot of respect for law enforcement, but how is it conceptually possible to be able to say that you're leading the way in terms of active shooter drills and helping with risk and all that stuff, but this person came in with the most benign phobia or generalized anxiety or whatever, was never related to violence, was never related to suicide, never related to risk. They just needed some help in that benign, again, non-violent, non-suicidal way. You can't properly assess that in suitability, but you can assess the highest risk. So you can assess the potential school shooter, but you can't determine that this guy, I had once call me irritable bowel syndrome. He's taking anti-anxiety medication. He needed a letter. Anything, they flag anything because it never is about the substance at that point. It's more just about the liability. You need a letter, you need a letter, you need a letter. So what I would implore the departments to think about, to the extent that they care, is you are really putting someone in a rough situation when you flag them as to what you said in terms of financial. The only way to get around that is if you somehow put the onus on the state. And if the state had to actually pay those things, you watch how quickly, those things go away. But to the extent that it's going to be on the petitioner, but the law. I mean, I've worked in the forensic arena, studied in the forensic arena the last 20 years, and you see this with resources. I mean, it's just unfortunately the nature of the legal system in an adversarial system.
At what point does this become does this tilt and a class action suit is filed because the state, i.e. the police, and it's not blaming police. I get that they do what they think they're supposed to do. I've come from a family full of cops. I teach the cops out here, but I can easily see what you're describing, which is just do the quick and easy thing, get it taken care of, and shuffle responsibility to somebody else, right? And then these firearms owners who are getting flagged for benign reasons all gather together over coffee one day, and they're like, "This is crap. This has cost us tens of thousands of dollars for no reason whatsoever." And then a suit gets filed and says, "This is discriminatory, and you're, I don't know, disproportionately inhibiting our lives. This is overly restrictive, whatever it is." And then the state is on the hook for all the financial burden that it placed upon its citizens, almost like if they were, indiscriminately pulling over people and citing them with
Yeah.
ridiculous reckless driving tickets, right?
Yeah, it's hard. Well, again, it depends, I guess, where you are. You're in New Jersey. You're in a state that's completely unsympathetic to anything related to gun ownership and what have you. So that's your first issue. There are groups out here that fight vigorously for gun rights. So maybe they might decide to take it on. But you know what I've seen, and I'm just being fair. I have to be fair. I'm objective. It's funny because a lot of times people say, "Oh, you're pro gun. Are you a gun actor? Are you pro?" I'm like, no, I'm really not. I'm just following the law. It's funny, especially in a state like New Jersey, you're either anti-gun or you're pro-gun. Like you can't just follow the law and the procedures, right? So I tell them like, no, it's not. I'm not in a box. It's just. So what I would say to the Second Amendment folks that work out here, and I have said this to them, is they really have to push. It's unfortunately it's on their shoulders too. What's happened, because you talk about the red flag laws before that don't require mental health evals. Well, look, in all fairness, for years they were saying they didn't want doctors and so forth and mental health professionals involved. So when you're telling people stay in your lane, with all due respect, to me, my humble recommendation would be forget about this is your lane, this is not your lane. Force people to be competent and qualified. Again, I don't want to bore your audience, but I could sit here and they could look at my publications. I could show you a laundry list of empirical evidence to show that they're not. And so instead of this is your lane, this is not your lane, understand, please, that there are some people, us, for example, who have developed competence in this area. But if you're going to force and push people out and say yes or no, then just like most laws, then it's just going to come down to who's in power. When this group's in power, it's going to be yes. When this group's in power. So when I used to consult with the state organization, I would say, please, we're going to make policies, even at the, kind of intra, I should say, organizational level. let's make policies assuming that the person you disagree with most is in charge, right? That's the only real way to make a policy, right? Because then you're focused more on the procedural aspects rather than what you're going to get, what you're going to do. But that's what we keep having. We have this no compromise, no compromise, no compromise. And so, frankly, I've had a lot of support from Second Amendment communities, some of them locally, but they're not going to really push it either because there's that fear, I think, of, you give an inch to take a yard, that kind of mentality, plays into politics and what have you. So, that's a real thing. But um, the the red flag stuff, again, and what you're talking about the cultural, what you were saying before about the cultural competence piece, that's why we put it in that framework, that this is about cultural competence. And again, we can't have it both ways. You can't, as medical and mental health professionals, on the one hand say this is an epidemic, right? That word is being used, and at the other hand say it's not it's not going to be a part of our training, or it's not a part of something we do. I don't even understand how. So what is it? Is it one of the most important things, or is it not? Because you're not matching it with your education and training and willingness to be a part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said the thing about stay in your lane, because I use that all the time. As a matter of fact, I lead with that usually when I'm speaking to mental health clinicians.
He just comes right out and says, "You stay in your lane."
No, I literally just say that one of the dumbest things the community did was tell doctors who are on the front lines of this to stay in their lane.
Yeah.
And I think it's helped. And the reason why everybody listening needs to understand, I have a certain method or approach to bring people together to find solutions. And it's not one of the pry it from my cold, dead hands. It's literally understanding people and what upsets them or where the issues are. And sometimes you got to bite your tongue. You just listen, take it in. You don't emotionally react. But we had 2 shootings last week and a half. And I'm so thankful and proud that I handled the things the way I did, because I have professionals or people from these organizations calling me now and saying they're emotional, and I say, I'm upset too, but they're saying, Mike, please explain this to me again, why this is a non-starter for the 2A community. And I love that, because when we kind of go through it and have this nuanced dialogue, they say, okay, I remember now. I get it, right? Because they're not living in our world. We shouldn't expect them to. But that's just the whole point, is if you continue to do things like, say, stay in your lane or get over on that side of the room, don't talk to me, you're never going to win anybody over like that. I've never seen it happen. Yeah. So I agree with you. There is a responsibility that the 2A community needs to take, and some of the conversations that have broken down that have led to this.
Yeah, with all due respect to the to some people in the community that I've even spoken with, again, you're actually letting them off the hook, right? So you might feel like, oh, I'm shutting them down. You're not. You're shutting the communication down, as you said, but you don't have any jurisdiction over those folks. So instead of going back to what I said before about holding people accountable and actually doing the kind of Aikido approach, right, which is bringing the energy in and saying, okay, where's this leading to, right? You're taking an authoritarian approach, because I told you so or something, but the problem is they're not your kids. I mean, it doesn't even work with kids anyway, or anyone, this authoritarian approach, but they're not your kids and they're not your subordinates, right? It's a doctor that you have 0 jurisdiction over, and you're saying stay in your lane. So all you've done is now they're going to just ignore you, because that's how people are going to react when you yell at them. And so they're just going to do whatever they want. So actually going to be more effective yelling at someone and say, stay in your lane, or saying, no, I want you to get trained properly. That now puts the onus on them, not letting them off the hook. The stay in your lane lets people off the hook.
I've been resisting the temptation to cross-reference Christian Conti for the 19th straight episode. But he was on before. I don't know if you know him, Johnny. He's from Pennsylvania. He's from in the Pittsburgh area. He's a psychologist. Does training in prison systems, and he developed this thing called yield theory, which is basically meet people where they are. And he's proud to say that he literally he wanted to change the way that prisons are run. He literally went into prisons to do this, right? So
Right.
literally meeting people where they are. You literally went to a gun shop to figure out
Yeah.
this thing about which you had no knowledge. That's what we're talking about. Mike literally went
Yeah.
to the mental health community and was like, teach me what you know. And now we've got, again, I'll say literally, because it's literally happening. I'm not misusing the word, which is common these days. Physicians are literally, and PhD, holding psychologists who study this stuff are literally going to Mike, the gun guy, and saying, help me understand this. This is what we're talking about. This is what's required. And when you yell at people or you shut down conversation, what you further do is inflame the limbic response. You elicit fight or flight and defensiveness, which shuts down cognition, and people are incapable of receiving new information into their frontal lobe to change their minds if they need to. So the yelling and screaming and invalidation is not working. We can't do that. We have to invite people in, and we have to humble ourselves with curiosity to say, what am I missing here? I need to
Yeah.
understand why this is so reactive and inflammatory. What am I missing, instead of just like continuing to flame each other? So I'm really proud of you doing that. I'm really proud of Mike doing that. I'm proud of all the people I know. I think I know who he's talking about. And it makes me proud to be a part of an organization and a movement that is trying to bring these two cultures together. And that's really what it is. When we say bridging the gap between, it means somebody has to leave their little perch and go into the other person's camp, and vice versa. And then the more often we do that, the smaller the gap gets, hopefully. And if we're modeling this for other people, if you're listening to this and you're like, wow, that sounds really scary. Yeah, it is. It's scary to have to evaluate your beliefs and maybe let go of some of them. But at least know where they come from, a bare minimum. So you're not just, knee jerking every time somebody says something you don't like or seems apparently to
Right.
attack you. So thank you for saying that. I really appreciate you covering that.
Yeah. And I always, I understand people have different motivations, but a lot of times I'll just say, look, even if you don't care to hear what people have to say, I'm like, for your own sake, don't you want them to hear everything you have to say? At the very least, be selfish about it. At the very least, be selfish about it and say, look, I want that person to hear everything I said. And what I've learned um, is people, as you're saying, are going to be more likely to sit there and listen to everything I have to say, fairly calm and respectful about it. So obviously, we all have different types of interactions every day. Now, if I'm just trying to, be angry in the moment and just say, oh, screw you or something and walk away, whatever that happens, obviously in life. I'm not saying you're going to sit down with every single person you walk across. I mean, obviously. But if you genuinely have a cause, you want to effectuate some sort of change and maybe see if someone will listen to you, then that's the only real way you're going to be able to do it. And so people don't, I guess, kind of don't realize that. It goes back to what I said before. Then they try to force things, and then it's just a back and forth of whoever's in power. And frankly, that's why I am kind of proud what I've done over the years, as I was saying before, because I don't have any power. I mean, there's different types of power, we know that, but to the extent that I have any power, it's referential power. It's kind of expert power. I don't. I mean, I have a business here and so forth, but aside from that, I don't have any power in the community. I'm not a politician. I'm not a lawmaker, right? I'm not a billionaire. All the things. I don't have a million followers. All the things associated with typical power in terms of the money, masses, media, right? All those kind of M's. I don't have any of that. So to the extent that you guys wake up on a Saturday and have any interest in what I have to say, it's really solely because I said I'm going to be completely independent and I'm going to be as genuine as possible. And it goes back to what we started, I think, the conversation off with was, Mike, you're asking about kind of the preface and how did I come into this? And I told that, and I don't disclose much. I don't really like to. If you look at my social media, you won't see one personal thing about me or my family or anything. I try to be very business and everything in public. But I disclosed that story as to like going to the gun range, and at the time it was my girlfriend. And I disclosed that because I said, so I want to be honest with people. You got to just be honest with people and be genuine, and then people will I think people appreciate, genuine nature. When you look at an actor or anyone, when things are believable, when they're genuine, you feel it more. And so, in certain contexts, disclosure is very powerful, right? So, but the problem is it gets overused, right? And so there's all these kind of, with all due respect to victims and their families and what have you, there's a lot of this overuse of these like apostrophe laws and this and that. And it's very high emotionality, high emotionality. And so it creates desensitization, right? When everything is super emotional at all times, people just start checking out and then it looks contrived. And so it's like being more careful about when we say things and when we use emotion and what have you. And that's why listservs, by the way, I don't know if anyone's on any listservs, they're a complete nightmare. I don't care who you talk to because it's just constant, just like social media, it's just like constant, like free association of thought. And a lot of times people don't think about, when should I say something? When should I not? It goes through what you're saying before, Mike. And I actually did it like this guest editorial years ago, a few years back now. And I posed the question to my colleagues in the state, for example, when are you off duty as a psychologist or as any professional? Because in other words, what I was seeing was I was seeing psychologists, they'd post something, right? So they'd post a picture of their family. Then they'd post a professional article that they had an opinion on. Then they'd post something else. And I'm like, but they were using their title, as well. Like, oh, I'm a psychologist, blah, 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 or whatever. But then it's like mixed in with all these other posts. And I'm like, which one? So then they get to hide, right? It goes back to the accountability. They get to kind of function in this limbo state where if you call them out and say, wait a minute, no, but that's my personal opinion. Well, you're not making it clear where your personal opinion is, where your professional opinion is, whatever. And so again, I guess, not intentionally, but I guess the theme of the day, maybe it's just one of my overarching worldviews, is that accountability thing. It's like, I just want to know where people stand, and if we can somehow diffuse some of the emotionality and some of the secondary gains that people get from, that moment, but it becomes boring, right? And so that's a whole nother conversation about the headlines are more interesting, the clickbait, the this, the that. I think the beginning of the book, you'll see a cite something about like the typical, obviously we know the typical post is like 40 characters or whatever. And, attention span for media clips is like 10 seconds or whatever it is, and that's an issue we have to contend with, guys, because, again, we're sitting here, for an hour and a half, I think, going through important issues, and we're only scratching we're just scratching the surface, as you well know. So how do we actually get people's attention, in a world where at light speed, the attention span is fading? I'd like to think we're entertaining, but I use a silly example. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but I say, if I post my book, I'll get 10 likes. If I post a picture of my dog, interacting with my book, I'll get 1,000 likes.
Yeah, it's
So
true.
then I kind of have to sit there, not to play the victim, so to speak, but I think you can relate to what I'm saying. It's like, I have to sit there and say, okay, at what point am I staying true to my principles as a professional and as a person, obviously? At what point would I be selling out? But there's that middle ground where it's like, no, it's not just one or the other. It's trying to somehow find that way of communicating, I was saying before, to a population that doesn't have a lot of time, is tired, that's going through things, and we have all this information, like you said, 650-page book. How do I convey that? If people only have 2 minutes, and how do I give service to that? So the best thing that I could try to do, or at least I'm trying to do, which is similar to you guys at this point, is just try. It's like reach one, teach one, right? It's like just try to work with other medical and mental health professionals, because it's kind of like the messenger, right? If you think like Malcolm Gladwell, like influencers and messengers, and that's where I find my little humble role as best as possible. Like you guys, I wrote a book, and I appreciate you saying all these good things about it, but in and of itself, it has no relevance. It's like currency. Like it's only good when it's used, and you guys found something maybe useful in it, and then you're going to tell the next person, and that's how it spreads. that's the only way to do it. And so I have to sit there in my, living room at 5 in the morning and convince myself that that might happen in the future. Whether it does or it doesn't, I don't know. No one's giving me any money for it. No one's giving me any guarantees. I just have to trust that it's the right thing to do, and maybe someone else will agree with me. And so I'm really fortunate that you guys. I'm really grateful to you guys.
I appreciate you coming on. It's to your point about what do you post, I think you can be both, and I think we need to start pushing that message. This is just me. I like pushing the message that people are multifaceted and very deep and
Sure.
infinite and have infinite potential to be many things. I am not solely marriage and family therapist. I'm not solely dad. I'm not
Right.
solely husband. I'm not solely washed up rec league baseball player. But I am all of those things. And so when somebody goes, "Well, how can you do?" It's like, yeah, I am. So I think that begets what you say, accountability. Accountability starts with authenticity and transparency. Now,
Right.
how transparent do you want to be with your family? I don't know, but you
Yeah.
can own all the decisions and all the behaviors that one ever does, right? And say, yeah, this is fully me, right? And to your point about the attention span, man, we debate this with Kevin, our marketing guy, all the time. What do we do to get to drive traffic, right? So is it short 30-second videos that we can boost on Instagram, long form podcast, short-ish informational videos on YouTube? And the answer is all of it. We do all of it
All of it.
because
Yeah.
I think there's an appetite and a market for all of it. And I got to believe too that as people are getting desensitized to the emotional flashpoints that are being thrown their way with the clickbait and the yellow journalism, the screamy headlines and all that stuff, I think people are starting to just wear out and they want long form conversations like this one. So, for my chair, we'll just keep doing this because somebody's going to find value in it at some point, even if it's a year and a half from now when they're like, I am burned out on talking points. I'm going to go dig deep into podcasts. And they find us 2 years later. Awesome. That's great. I hope it helps somebody.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Mike?
Well, I think we got to have you back on for sure because there's a lot of stuff I didn't even get to, and I know we're pushing up against it. I do have one question I want to ask you. Godfather, I'll call you the Godfather of mental health and firearms.
Right.
You wrote the
Thank you.
Bible, right? How do
Thank you.
you tend to your mental health, you personally?
Oh, thank you. It's a great question. Geez, well, I'm happy you asked me that question now and not, 10 years ago or something. I had no idea even what that meant, kind of growing up is a whole nother conversation, but also even through school and everything. It was always this kind of side point like, oh, don't forget about your mental health or vicarious trauma or, these kind of buzzwords as you're going through school. But at the same time, the professor's kind of mentioning that on one hand, they're just loading you with work on the other hand, and you got to work on some, So it was never an actual real thing for me until once I got out of school. Now, if people can do it before that, God bless them. But for me, it's something I've had to develop over time and really work on. And I guess what I would say, just as from a practical standpoint, I exercise every morning, and it kind of, in a way, it throws off my day because, of course, I could use that hour, for other things. But I just keep reminding myself that that is, you know, that is part of my day, and I must do that. I know that for myself, and so exercise for me is really important. Frankly, each morning. And I also have children and a family, so forth, and a wife and what have you, and a puppy and all this stuff. So that, kind of my family time and my exercise time is really critically important. But just from a maybe more overarching standpoint, as a professional, especially in the forensic arena, we put out an article, I think it was last year, on vicarious trauma, burnout, compassion fatigue, these things. Um, that's something that's not talked about. In that article we spoke about like gallows humor, especially in the forensic arena, and a lot of professions, medical and mental health. We kind of make jokes about things, about clients or this or that, to try to get through it, to ease the anxiety of it. You see this obviously, and especially in tough professions, but we see it really anywhere. And I think for me, the biggest thing I try to do is, it goes to what Jake was saying a little bit, is being authentic with everybody, just treating everybody with respect. And it's like, well, how does that help your mental health in a way? For me, it helps keep me grounded, just as a general rule. It helps keeps me humble, and I'm not the most humble person in the world. I was I really had to learn something, and I can get arrogant pretty quickly. I mean, I have that Southern Italian, Northern New Jersey style that, if you start challenging me, you'll see it come out, and so I'm aware of that. But I try to stay as humble as I possibly can to the, within my own personality. And one of the ways I do that is just, I don't care who the person calls me or who's in front of me or whatever. I just try to treat them with such respect, because I'm always afraid that I'm gonna get too big of a head, and then that's gonna have a domino effect in my life, because then I'm gonna think, I want to do this and I want to do that, and I'm gonna kind of start forgetting about the nuts and bolts of what makes me tick and my family and my day to day and what have you. So I just really try to do that honestly as like an overarching mentality. When I need to pull out kind of the tough guy persona, in a professional way. I'm not a personal tough guy, but look, when you get hit with a Sabina or when you're getting cross-examined or something, you can't kind of just sit there and be all humble. You got to step up, in certain moments, obviously. Um, but otherwise, I just try to, again, like, be with you guys. Just talk. Just, we're human beings, and whatever. For me, that helps so much, because the world, I know it kind of sounds maybe like, silly, but it's that attunement with the world, right? It's like the world then feeds you that back. So if I'm genuine with you and we're just talking, straight up, and I'm getting a bad vibe back, and then we're probably not clicking, and so then I've learned, of course, as an adult, like, maybe we shouldn't connect, that maybe we don't have a good fit. And so, it's like, I think people kind of struggle with that a lot, because they say, well, how do I know who to gravitate towards or not? And that's where families get tricky, right? Because it becomes obligatory and all that stuff. So for me, I try not to fall into like obligatory stuff. It's more like, hey, yeah, it's Saturday morning, but I'm happy to be here with these guys because we're being genuine and we're just talking, and, it's you know, just straight up real stuff. This is life. Whereas it could be Tuesday during the workday, and I don't want to talk to this person because they're not being that. So that's kind of what I've learned to do a little bit, is just making time for like real stuff in life, and not taking my work so seriously, and going back to the idea of forcing it. Just because it's between the hours of 9 and 5 doesn't mean I'm a punching bag. Doesn't mean I'm a dumpster. Doesn't mean, whatever. It doesn't mean you get to kind of do whatever because I'm on the clock or whatever. So it's like, I've just learned that about myself, about boundaries, and like, being genuine and trying to just gravitate and be around people who are similar in that way. We could completely disagree. People who disagree with me the most on issues, we get along swimmingly if we have that type of mentality and respect. So that's goes back to that idea of like communicating with people. You're gonna know, like, if you're trying to communicate genuinely with people and they don't want to hear it, then you're wasting your time probably, sadly. So
Oh, great Godfather, you are so wise.
well, yeah, we're all trying to figure it out, right? We're all
I
trying to
pray
figure it
that
out.
your
Oh my
next book is a masculine book.
god. Exactly. Well, hope maybe that's a, I don't want to invite myself. I think you said maybe I can come back in 2022. I would think in another year or so, we're gonna have the handbook out. We're working on the manual for that firearm evaluation framework, that BF10. Hopefully, I'm thinking, guys, honestly, if we check back in a year, we're gonna have a lot of new developments, a lot of things to talk about. I think that handbook is really gonna be that stepping stone, that's gonna get us to the action-oriented stuff, and then with some of the training stuff. And we just got to get this stuff into the hands of, you know, medical schools, and we got to start at the ground level. I mean, I know we're trying to get people who are already practicing, and that's important, but we got to get into that ground level of like medical schools, graduate schools, training programs, colleges, get it in there, because we're on the same page. So thank you so much, guys.
Pleasure's ours, really. without you doing this stuff, and I will point out, very selflessly, around the time that you're committed to your patient load and your daily work, like you said, writing a little in the morning, write a little in the evening, the weekends, before you know it, you got a full-blown research project and a published book. And that's really remarkable. And I think it's a gift to the community. And certainly our folks are the people who follow what we're doing, subscribe to and believe in our mission. It all originated from that. So if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, I could never write a book, it's like, yeah, you can. A little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. You don't eat the whole elephant at once.
Yeah.
Hey, by the way, who are Haley Wexler and Robert Kramer? We should probably mention them.
Yep. So they're psychologists. They're in a couple different states now. It's hard to keep track of where people is. Haley's, I think, on the West Coast still. She's a practicing psychologist now, and Rob Kramer is a professor who was trained at University of Alabama. I came up with Rob when I was at John Jay. Alabama and John Jay had a really close connection, and so he's a brilliant guy in terms of the suicide arena. And Haley is fantastic. She's forensically trained. We've all kind of been forensically trained, different programs, and so they're colleagues. And the book I'm writing now is with Sarah DeMarco, and she's in my practice, and we do these evaluations every day. So I think what you're going to see again moving forward, because I am proud of that book and I appreciate everything you said about it. But I think the next book, what you're really going to see is, literally again, the hands-on kind of, this is what we deal with on a day to day, so that's the evolution, right? That's what we're working towards. That kind of book was like, it needed to be done, it needed to be laid out, and now we're pushing into, applying this stuff. And it's funny, it's just organic. I guess it's the only word I could really think of. When I try to think of what my motivation is and so forth, because again, essentially not gotten a dollar for anything. It's never really been about that. It's just, at least directly. Obviously indirectly you get referrals and stuff, but it's just this organic desire. I think when you're a scientist and you're trained that way, I was trained as a scientist practitioner. It's just ingrained in you. Like you try to find out the truth, try to get the answers, try to get to the bottom of it. And I'd like to say this before I leave, because I can be really critical. If you look at my Facebook posts, if you look at some of the stuff I said today, I can be really critical and even quote people on names. I said Rutgers, and I just want to be really clear again. It's not a personal thing. It's just, it bothers me at such a level, some of this, because these are the same people that I was sitting next to in class. These are the same people who taught me. These are the same people who, like, I really believed in the science. I really believe, like, this is the scientific method. This is how you approach it. This is the objectivity that we're supposed to move forward. And so when I see the politics come in, it's like such a visceral reaction I have, when I feel like we're vacating, our principles as professionals. And so I really want to say that, because honestly, you can see me come out with some really critical stuff and some snarky stuff that I will say. And it's really, I want people to know, coming from a place of I don't want to sound like silly about it, but it's like almost like hurt in a way. Not that I know these people personally, but it's like hurtful in the sense like, come on, like we're all trying so hard. We're all working so hard, to get this stuff across. We went to school for a million years. We're pounding the pavement every day. Why are you doing this? You're setting us back. Please stop. So it's kind of more of like that you'll see out of me. But you know, I try to hold my tongue, as Mike kind of was suggesting before. I try as best as I can. Sometimes I can't, and I kind of get frustrated. But I keep trying to tell myself, just overshadow it. Just keep working hard. Just keep putting out the stuff that I believe is right, and strong guidance and whatever, and just keep pushing that. And the kind of, eventually that'll overshadow a lot of it. But the political thing, there's not much we can do about that. We just have to keep pushing forward.
I want to validate that before we go. I have so many stories that I will not share now, but maybe sometime over beer we can talk about it. But I know exactly what you're saying, and it is hard and it is hurtful. It hurts when you see people abandon principle for whatever they abandon it for. And I
Yeah.
totally identify with that. I've experienced it in my own community. You're not alone. It's hard, man. So, well, that all being said, thank you very much, Gianni Pirelli,
Yes.
from New Jersey, for coming on. The book, The Behavioral Science of Firearms. You can find it anywhere books are sold, really. It's about 65 to 70 bucks on Amazon. It's worth it. It's a very easy read. It's kind of the theoretical, conceptual, background laying, uh, preeminent book on mental health and guns. And the next one that comes out sounds like it'll be more practical, application oriented. So I'm excited for that. How do people get a hold of you?
So easiest way is check out my website is gpirelli.com, GPIRELLI.com, and you'll see a lot of stuff on there, and probably get any information you want. And if anyone needs any other kind of articles or anything that we've written, you'll see my CV and all that stuff is on there. Just send me an email. We can get you some of the articles we've written, and again, we publish in different areas as well. So reach out anytime. We're only licensed in those couple states by us, so we're really limited from a practice sense, but we're happy to talk to people. So.
Well, we appreciate it. So, on behalf of our title sponsor for the podcast, Arms Corps, and on behalf of Zephyr Wellness, the company that I co own here in Northern Nevada, and on behalf of our entire Walk the Talk America family, thanks for listening. Please share around, subscribe, give us a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. And don't leave this stuff locked up in your head. We're trying to all make Earth better together. And the more people get exposed to it, the better off we all are. Thank you, Michael, for doing what you do. Thanks, Johnny. And we will see you, listening audience, on the next episode. We wish you all great mental wellness. Bye bye.
Awesome.